"Your dock is illegal," Marcus Heller sneered across the polished meeting table, his voice dripping with certainty. "You've got 30 days to tear it down, or the fines start stacking, $100 a day until compliance. And if you ignore us, we'll take it to lien." His smug smile told me he thought the threat was final, that my family's dock was already dead in the water. I let the silence hang, just long enough for his words to echo through the small boardroom where the other HOA officers sat like nervous jurors. Then I leaned forward. "Funny thing, Marcus. That dock? It's not just some backyard structure. It's on county record, grandfathered, permanent, and legally untouchable. And you know who wrote half the bylaws you're trying to twist against me? I did. Property law is my field." His smile faltered, just for a flicker, and I saw it. The first crack in his armor. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. He recovered quickly, scoffing, trying to shrug it off. But I didn't need him to believe me. I just needed the room to hear it. "Daniel Rourke," I said evenly, civil rights attorney. "My father built that dock 30 years ago, and it's as solid in law as it is in timber." The words weren't raised, but they cut sharper than any gavel. And that's where this story begins. Because that dock isn't just wooden nails on Willow Glen Lake. It's the last piece of my father I can touch. I learned to fish off it as a boy, lost my first fight with a catfish at the edge of its planks, and scattered his ashes from it when cancer took him. Every ripple against those pilings carries his voice back to me, telling me to hold my ground, telling me not to bend to men like Marcus Heller. Marcus thought this was about some aesthetic violation. He thought he could shove me into submission like he had with so many of my neighbors. But for me, it's about more than a structure. It's about legacy, about memory, about refusing to let a man with a clipboard and a crooked smile erase what family left behind. And the moment he slammed my sister against this very table, he turned a fight over timber into a war over dignity. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. Because trust me, Marcus isn't just bluffing, and I'm not just defending a dock. Where are you watching from? Maybe your HOA tried to tell you what color your shutters should be, or maybe you've seen neighbors cave under threats. But hear me now, Marcus Heller chose the wrong person to push. I don't bluff, and I don't back down. And before this is over, he'll wish he'd never put my family's name on his violation list. Marcus's threat still rang in my ears as I stepped out of the clubhouse and into the chill evening air. The lake reflected the last streaks of sunset, calm on the surface. But I knew a storm had just been unleashed. My father's dock stood steady against the glow, a silent promise that I wasn't done. By the time I reached my car, I'd already decided this fight would be more than personal. It would be a reckoning. The very next morning, I found my front lawn marked with another violation notice, this time staked into the ground with a metal post like some kind of warning sign. Bright red letters screamed, "Final warning." Neighbors walked past slower than usual, stealing glances, whispering to one another. Marcus didn't want compliance. He wanted humiliation. The message was clear: bend or be broken. I tore the notice from the post and carried it to the community pool, a place Marcus loved to parade his authority during summer. The gates were locked now for the off-season, the chairs stacked, water dark and still. I stood there a long moment, the paper crumpling in my fist, imagining all the families who'd avoided this pool last summer after Marcus tripled the access fees. He claimed it was for safety upgrades, but anyone who paid attention knew the money went elsewhere. The pool wasn't a luxury. It was supposed to be part of what kept Willow Glen alive. Instead, it was a monument to neglect. That realization pressed down on me. It wasn't just me and my dock. It was every family forced to choose silence or punishment. Every child told they couldn't swim because Marcus had turned common ground into his private ledger. And that's when I knew. If I fought this only for myself, I'd lose. But if I fought it for everyone, Marcus would have no shield. By afternoon, Marcus's patrol truck rolled through the neighborhood again, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Curtains shifted, dogs barked, and I watched from the edge of the pool fence. He thrived on the theater of intimidation, and he believed fear was unshakable. But intimidation only works until someone calls it what it is. I went back home and laid the violation notice on my dining table next to the stack from before. I didn't see warnings anymore. I saw exhibits, each one a piece of a larger puzzle. And the more I looked, the more the cracks revealed themselves. Mismatched dates, fines that had no clear vote behind them, notices issued without the quorum the bylaws required. They weren't careful because they never imagined someone with my background would care enough to check. That evening, I walked to the small park near the subdivision entrance. The playground sat empty, swings rattling in the breeze, the basketball court lit by a single flickering lamp. It was here parents used to gather, swapping stories while kids played until the streetlights came on. Now it was abandoned, another casualty of fees, fines, and Marcus's endless power games. The silence carried weight, and standing there, I understood why so many neighbors bowed their heads and paid up. Fighting back wasn't just hard, it felt impossible. But impossible was my specialty. I'd taken on city councils and landlords who thought they could bulldoze through constitutional protections. This wasn't different. In fact, Marcus was smaller, weaker, sloppier. He just didn't know it yet. As the wind rustled the leaves overhead, I promised myself I wouldn't just defend the dock. I'd turn Marcus's system against him, piece by piece, until the very rules he hid behind collapsed under their own illegitimacy. He thought control meant safety, but control without legality is paper thin. And I was already pulling at the first thread. When I walked home under the pale glow of streetlights, I felt eyes on me. Some neighbors watched quietly from their porches, others hurried inside. They didn't know yet which side would win, but they could sense the air shifting. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't folding, and Marcus's power, like the locked pool or the empty park, was starting to look less permanent than he wanted anyone to believe. The night after my walk through the park, I sat on my porch watching the still water of the lake reflect the streetlights. My father's dock jutted into the dark like an unspoken challenge. The air was heavy with silence, yet I could feel the tension crawling across the neighborhood. The board had drawn its line, but so had I. What neither side expected was the fracture already forming inside their ranks. 2 days later, I saw Grace Turner again. She was the HOA secretary, Marcus's right hand when it came to record keeping and correspondence. But unlike Marcus, her posture never screamed authority. At the small community library, where residents checked out donated books, she moved between the shelves with shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. I watched her from the end of an aisle. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, then quickly glanced around before pulling a slim binder from her tote. Her fingers hesitated, gripping the cover too tightly, knuckles pale against the fluorescent light. The binder disappeared just as fast, shoved back into the bag when another resident walked in. Her eyes darted toward me, then away, like someone afraid of being caught looking too long at the wrong person. The body doesn't lie. She shifted her stance every few seconds, one foot angling toward the exit, the other stubbornly planted. Conflict radiated from her without a word spoken. She wasn't comfortable with Marcus's methods, that much was obvious, but fear stitched her lips shut. Still, fear doesn't create hesitation like that unless conscience is pressing hard from the other side. When she signed the library log, her pen hovered mid-page. Her hand trembled just enough for the ink to blot, and she pressed her palm flat against the paper as though trying to erase the slip. The man behind her coughed impatiently, and she recoiled, muttering an apology before nearly fleeing through the door. Her shoulders curled inward as she walked away, arms tight across her chest, as though holding herself together was her only defense. I stepped outside a moment later, the cool air hitting my face. Across the parking lot, Grace paused at her car, keys dangling from her hand, but not moving toward the door. She stared at the asphalt, lips pressed thin, then looked up sharply, scanning the lot as though the shadows themselves might be listening. When she finally got in, she slammed the door with more force than necessary, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her wrists shook. She didn't start the car right away. She just sat there, still as stone, caught between decision and paralysis. I didn't need words to understand. Grace Turner was wrestling with more than her conscience. She held something, documents, knowledge, proof, that weighed on her every movement. She was tied to Marcus through her role, but each glance, each flinch, screamed she no longer believed in the authority she served. That realization was a turning point. My strategy required more than my own expertise. It required cracks in Marcus's foundation, proof from inside his camp that the board's authority was rotted through. Grace was that crack. She might not have known it yet, but her silence wouldn't hold. The truth always leaks, especially when the keeper of it looks like she's drowning under the pressure. The following day, the HOA office was open for limited hours. I walked past deliberately, not to confront Marcus, but to see. Through the blinds, I spotted Grace at her desk, back straight but rigid, her eyes flicking between papers and the door. Marcus hovered nearby, arms crossed, his voice rising at intervals I couldn't hear. Grace's shoulders twitched with every syllable, and once, she rubbed her temple with the back of her hand as though fighting a headache born from stress. It was written all over her. Loyalty to Marcus was eroding, but fear kept her anchored. And yet, fear has a breaking point. The body language I'd seen, hesitation, trembling, glances over her shoulder, wasn't the posture of someone convinced Marcus was right. It was the posture of someone praying for an out. That night, as I stood on my dock listening to the ripple of water against wood, I knew the tide was turning. Grace wouldn't speak yet, but she would. And when she did, her testimony wouldn't just open a door, it would blow Marcus's defenses wide apart. The night air on the dock had steadied me, but I knew peace wouldn't last. Marcus had a pattern. When intimidation failed, escalation followed. He couldn't afford to let cracks show, not with the board already whispering and neighbors beginning to notice. Sure enough, by the weekend, his next move arrived like a gauntlet thrown at my doorstep. On Saturday morning, I walked outside to find a bright yellow sign staked into my yard. Immediate action. Required, it read, in bold black letters. Below, the notice claimed my dock posed significant liability risks and threatened that if I didn't dismantle it voluntarily, the board would pursue emergency legal remedies. The language was vague but designed to sound lethal, the kind of threat that made most residents panic into compliance. But I wasn't most residents. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into a folder. Marcus was doing me a favor. Each overreach was more evidence. Each empty threat another fracture in the HOA's authority. Still, evidence wasn't enough on its own. I needed visibility. Marcus thrived in shadows, in private letters, and closed-door meetings. To weaken him, I had to drag his tactics into the light. That afternoon, I walked to the community pavilion near the lake, where neighbors often gathered for cookouts or casual meetings. The picnic tables sat empty now, abandoned under Marcus's regime. I pinned the notice to the corkboard where announcements were posted. Yard sales, babysitter services, the occasional lost pet flyer. The bright yellow paper stood out like a warning flare. Within an hour, people drifted by. Some glanced nervously and walked on, but others lingered. I saw a father with his young daughter stop to read, his brow furrowed as he muttered something under his breath. Two older women shook their heads, whispering that Marcus had gone too far this time. A teenager pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, no doubt sending it through the neighborhood's private group chat. The pavilion became my stage, and the notice my exhibit. I didn't need speeches, the paper spoke for itself. By evening, I overheard conversations that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. They did that to me, too. Remember when they tried to fine us for the wrong mailbox color? If he can go after Daniel, what's stopping him from going after us next? Fear was still there, but it was shifting, turning into frustration, simmering into anger. But Marcus wasn't blind to this. The next day, his white patrol truck rolled up to the pavilion. I watched from across the street as he yanked the notice down, his jaw tight, his gestures sharp. He crumpled the paper in his fist, tossed it into the truck, and drove off. He could silence a bulletin board, but he couldn't erase the conversations that had already begun. That night, I sat at my dining table, reviewing the pattern of his escalation. Threats of fines, claims of liability, now vague promises of legal action. But none of it carried legal weight if the board lacked standing, and every aggressive step he took only fueled the argument I was building. His arrogance was becoming my strongest ally. I decided to widen my view. The next morning, I went to the county records office downtown, a sterile building with buzzing lights and the faint smell of dust and paper. I wasn't there to dig through hidden boxes. I was there for official, public information. I requested the HOA's incorporation documents, renewal filings, and status reports. The clerk returned with a thin folder, far thinner than it should have been for an association running nearly 3 decades. Inside, I saw dates that didn't line up, renewals that hadn't been properly filed, and most importantly, gaps in the years Marcus claimed absolute authority. It wasn't the smoking gun yet, but it was the smoke. And where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Walking out of the county building, the autumn sun cut across my face, and I felt clarity settle in. Marcus thought escalation would bury me. Instead, it had driven me straight to the heart of his weakness. The dock was my personal stake, but legitimacy was his Achilles heel. And now, I had my hand on it. The file from the county office stayed heavy in my hands as I walked back to my car. Inside were the gaps Marcus never wanted anyone to see. Missing renewals, lapses in filing, proof that the HOA's authority wasn't as absolute as he pretended. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a direction, a fracture line waiting for pressure. That evening, I carried the folder to a new setting, the neighborhood coffee shop just outside Willow Glen's gates. It was one of the few neutral places residents could gather without Marcus looming over them. The warm air smelled of espresso and baked bread, but the undercurrent was tension. Conversations hushed when I walked in, eyes flicking toward the folder tucked under my arm. I chose a table near the window. The folder sat in front of me like a loaded weapon. I opened it slowly, scanning the renewal records again, making notes in the margins. A shadow fell across the table. When I looked up, it wasn't Marcus. It was a neighbor, an older man named Harold, who'd lived here since before the board turned hostile. "Is it true," he asked in a low voice, "that they don't have their paperwork in order?" His eyes darted toward the folder. I didn't answer directly, but I let the silence and the open page speak for me. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line, his hand tightening on the chair back, before he turned and walked out, faster than he'd come in. Word travels. By the time I left the coffee shop, I knew whispers would already be running through the neighborhood, and whispers have a way of growing louder once they catch momentum. That night, I spread the documents across my dining table, every page illuminated under a single lamp. I mapped the timeline against the bylaws. In several years, the board had levied fines and made rulings without valid legal standing. That meant countless punishments and payments had been built on nothing but intimidation and the community's ignorance of the law. The discovery wasn't just mine anymore. It was bigger than the dock. It meant every neighbor who'd paid a fine, every resident who'd been threatened, every family forced into compliance, they had all been subject to authority that might not legally exist. But discovery without proof in the right setting is just noise. I needed confirmation, something official to back what I was seeing. So, the next morning I returned to the county office, this time requesting an expert consultation with the clerk supervisor. She flipped through the same thin file I had studied, her brows knitting tighter with each missing document. Finally, she closed the folder and shook her head. "These records aren't current," she said. "Your HOA hasn't filed renewal paperwork in nearly 7 years. Technically, their incorporation is expired. They're still functioning as a board, but their authority..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Authority without legitimacy is smoke, and I had just confirmed the fire. Leaving the office, I felt the ground shift. Marcus's threats, his fines, even his assault against my sister. They weren't just acts of aggression. They were actions taken under the guise of power that legally no longer existed. The law wasn't on his side. It was on mine. That evening, I didn't go back to the dock or the pavilion. I walked to the neighborhood playground instead, where the cracked swings swayed gently in the wind. Parents avoided it now, but I stood under the rusted basketball hoop, folder in hand, feeling the weight of what I'd uncovered. My father's dock was the heart of this fight, but legitimacy was the weapon. I thought of Grace Turner then, her trembling hands, her hesitant glances, the binder she'd clutched like a lifeline. She already knew parts of this. Her body had told the story before her voice ever could, and when she finally broke her silence, her testimony would stitch perfectly into the evidence I now carried. The night settled heavy over Willow Glen, but I felt lighter. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just overreaching. He was cornered, even if he didn't know it yet. And soon, I'd make sure every neighbor saw what I now held in my hands, the truth that would unravel him. The playground silence still clung to me when I walked home that night, But inside, I carried a steady fire. The folder sat on my dining table, its thin stack of papers carrying more weight than anything Marcus had pinned to my door. Proof of his expired authority. Proof that every threat he made was built on air. But proof alone wasn't enough. To break a man like Marcus, I needed timing, leverage, and a way to make the truth undeniable to everyone watching. The following morning, I found his next escalation waiting. A certified letter sat in my mailbox, stamped with official language but hollow at its core. Immediate enforcement action, it declared, threatening that the board would seek judicial remedies unless the dock was removed within 10 days. The words were bold, but I recognized them for what they were: bluff and bluster. Without legal standing, they couldn't enforce a thing. Yet Marcus counted on most residents not knowing the difference. I carried the letter not to my kitchen, but to a new battlefield, my office downtown. I hadn't brought this fight into my professional space before, but now it demanded it. The office was quiet, the blinds half drawn, stacks of case files lining the shelves. I laid Marcus's letter beside the incorporation records, then pulled out a legal pad. My pen moved quickly, sketching outlines of the argument I would eventually present. The law was simple. Without proper renewal, the board lacked authority to impose fines, enforce rules, or threaten liens. But strategy required more than law. It required the right narrative. As I worked, flashes of memory intruded, my father's rough hands guiding mine on the dock, the creak of wood under our boots, his voice telling me never to let anyone strip away what we built. This wasn't just about statutes and filings. It was about honoring that promise. Every stroke of my pen became a line between Marcus's arrogance and my father's legacy. By midday, I drafted the skeleton of a petition. It wasn't time to file yet, but it was ready, an arrow resting on the bowstring. The urgency pressed closer now. Marcus had given me 10 days, but in truth, it was me who had set the clock. 10 days to prepare, 10 days to gather what I needed, 10 days before I turned his threats back on him. Leaving the office, I stopped at the courthouse steps. The stone columns loomed overhead, a reminder of the weight of law that Marcus had chosen to ignore. I stood there, folder under my arm, imagining the day I'd walk through those doors with neighbors behind me and truth in my hand. The courthouse wasn't just a building. It was the place where Marcus's false power would fracture for good. Back in Willow Glen that evening, I walked the neighborhood again, this time with sharper eyes. The cracks in Marcus's regime were everywhere. Residents paying fees with resentment etched on their faces, couples whispering at their mailboxes, children asking why the pool stayed closed. His intimidation had bought silence, but silence was eroding. People didn't need courage yet. They just needed proof, and I was holding it. At the far end of the subdivision, near the community garden, I stopped. The plots were overgrown. Once proud beds of flowers and vegetables now wild with weeds. A woman kneeling in the dirt looked up at me briefly, then went back to pulling stubborn roots. There was no joy in her movements, only obligation, like someone maintaining ground she no longer believed in. That garden was supposed to be communal, a symbol of growth. Now it mirrored the HOA itself, neglected, mismanaged, drained of spirit. The sight tightened my resolve. Marcus had built his control on fear, but fear withers when exposed to light. Soon the garden would not be the only thing left untended. His authority itself was withering, and I was ready to show the neighborhood, the rot at its core. That night, as I stood once again at the edge of my father's dock, the water lapping softly at the posts, I knew the stakes had shifted. It wasn't only about defending wood and nails, or even my family's legacy. It was about setting a clock Marcus couldn't control. His threats had made the fight personal. My discovery had made it urgent. And now, the countdown had begun. The lake whispered against the pilings as I stood on my father's dock, but my mind wasn't on the water. It was on the countdown I'd started in my head. 10 days before Marcus's hollow deadline expired. 10 days before I turned his threats into his undoing. The discovery at the county office was my weapon. But I needed something more, an insider to stitch the truth together. And whether she knew it or not, Grace Turner was already leaning in that direction. 2 evenings later, I saw her again. This time not at the library or HOA office, but in a place Marcus couldn't control, the church fellowship hall near the neighborhood's edge. It wasn't Sunday service. It was a community potluck, one of the few spaces where Willow Glen residents still dared to gather without the HOA's shadow. Folding tables were lined with crock pots and casseroles, the smell of baked bread and spiced chili hanging in the air. Children ran between chairs, their laughter breaking through the tension adults tried to bury in small talk. Grace sat alone near the back, a paper plate untouched in front of her. Her shoulders were hunched, eyes cast down, fingers fidgeting with the edge of a napkin until it tore. Every movement screamed conflict. When she finally looked up, our eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She gestured slightly, a nervous flick of her hand, and I walked over. We didn't speak at first. The noise of the hall covered the silence between us, but her body language told the story. Tight grip on her bag, shallow breaths, the way she leaned forward as though she was about to leap into something dangerous. Finally, she opened her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her hands trembled as she slid it across the table toward me, then pressed flat against the surface as if holding it there would stop her from snatching it back. "I can't keep pretending," she whispered, her voice nearly lost under the chatter of the room. "He knows the filings aren't current. We've known for years." Her eyes glistened, and she blinked rapidly, ashamed but unrelenting. "Marcus told us to bury it, said no one would ever check. He threatened to strip me from the board if I spoke, said he'd ruin me in front of the neighborhood I unfolded the paper. It was an internal email chain, Marcus instructing the board to operate as normal, despite expired status, mocking the idea that any homeowner lawyer will ever waste the time digging through dusty records. The arrogance dripped from every line. My discovery at the Weil County office had been smoke. Grace had just handed me the fire. She wiped her palms against her skirt, her entire body taut with the relief and terror of confession. I shouldn't have kept it this long, but every time I saw another notice go out, every time a neighbor paid a fine they didn't owe, it felt heavier. And then, what he did to your sister. Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together hard, forcing composure. For a moment, she looked smaller, fragile under the fluorescent lights, like someone drowning who had just broken the surface for air. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Grace, this isn't just my fight anymore. What you've given me, it changes everything. But you need to be ready. Marcus will come after you harder than anyone, once he knows." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw resolve flicker behind her eyes. "Then let him." I've been silent too long. The fellowship hall noise carried on around us, but the table we sat at had become its own battlefield. Grace's confession wasn't just support, it was validation. Her words, her document, tied my legal discovery to intent. Marcus hadn't just let the filings lapse. He had knowingly deceived the entire neighborhood, enforcing authority he knew didn't exist. As I left the hall later that night, the paper folded safely into my folder, I felt the weight of what had just shifted. Marcus's foundation had been cracked wide open by one of his own. Grace Turner had crossed the line from silence to truth, and her choice gave me more than evidence. It gave me momentum. The dock still stood under the moonlight when I returned home, steady and unbroken. Now, I wasn't the only one standing for it, and Marcus's clock was ticking louder. The moonlight still shimmered off the lake when I sat back down at my dining table, Grace's paper spread out beside the county filings. Together, they told a story too sharp to ignore. Marcus knew the HOA's incorporation had expired and ordered the board to carry on as if nothing had changed. That wasn't negligence, that was deception. But evidence alone wasn't strategy. I had to transform it into a plan that would break Marcus in the open, not just on paper. I opened my legal pad and began mapping it out, line by line. Step 1. Compile the county's confirmation of expired status. Step 2. Pair it with Grace's email chain, proving knowledge and intent. Step 3. Frame the timeline of violations and fines as acts carried out under false authority. And finally, Step 4. Deliver it in a forum Marcus couldn't control. The decision of where to strike was simple. The community center, where the next board meeting would be held. But preparation required more than just showing up with documents. I needed to build the narrative so that when the truth dropped, the neighbors saw not just Marcus's failure, but the pattern of abuse that had touched them all. 2 days later, I took my plan to a new location. The law library at the university where I sometimes lectured. The vaulted ceilings, the smell of old paper, the silence broken only by the scratch of pens. It was the perfect place to refine my weapon. I cross-referenced statutes on nonprofit incorporation, case law on expired authority, and the county's rules for enforcement. Each citation tightened the net around Marcus. I thought about my sister as I worked, about the moment he slammed her against that meeting table, about the way the neighbor's eyes had darted away in fear. This wasn't just about exposing illegitimacy. It was about restoring dignity to a community he had bullied into silence. Every statute I underlined, every note I jotted, carried that weight. Late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor I barely knew. "Heard you're fighting Marcus. If you need signatures, let me know." Word had already begun to spread from the potluck hall, proof that Grace's confession was rippling outward. Her decision had broken the silence, and now others were starting to test their voices. I added another step to my plan: community awareness. It wouldn't be enough to walk into the board meeting and drop documents. I needed residents to arrive already questioning Marcus, already primed to see him not as the enforcer of rules, but as a fraud hiding behind them. That meant carefully leaking the truth in places where his intimidation couldn't smother it. That evening, I stopped at the neighborhood park. A few teenagers sat on the swings, scrolling on their phones, while a couple walked a dog along the cracked path. I didn't stage a speech. I simply left copies of the violation letter Marcus had mailed me pinned to the bulletin board, beside a highlighted section of the bylaws requiring current incorporation for enforcement. It wasn't accusation, just fact placed in plain sight. The same method I'd used at the pavilion was working again: visibility. By the time I returned home, my plan was no longer theory. It was a sequence. Grace's insider confession gave me credibility. The county's records gave me authority. The law gave me framework. And the neighbors, once silent, were beginning to stir. I spent the night rehearsing not just legal arguments, but delivery. Calm, measured, undeniable. I wouldn't give Marcus the satisfaction of anger. I would let the facts speak, and in their weight, his arrogance would collapse. Standing on the dock before bed, I traced my hand over the weathered rail. My father had built it steady, each board locked into place so storms couldn't tear it apart. That's what my plan felt like now, joined piece by piece, stronger because it had been tested. Marcus had given me 10 days. I intended to use every one. The dock's weathered rail was still beneath my hand when morning broke, but the calm I felt in that moment quickly hardened into resolve. Marcus had given me a deadline. Now I was setting mine. The plan was built, but plans mean nothing without execution. Preparation had to be precise, and it had to begin immediately. I carried my folder to the community library, the quiet hub where residents still drifted in and out without fear of Marcus's shadow. The tables were half filled with retirees reading newspapers and children flipping through picture books. I chose a corner table, spread out the documents, and began organizing everything into a sequence that no one could dismiss. The county filings came first, the official records that proved expiration. Next, Grace's email chain, clear evidence of knowledge and intent. Then the violation notices Marcus had plastered across my door and yard, each one now transformed from threat to exhibit. As I worked, I noticed the subtle shift around me. Neighbors passed by, slowing just enough to glance at the papers. A few lingered longer, eyes scanning the highlighted passages before pretending to browse nearby shelves. Word had already spread, but now they could see it for themselves. The proof that Marcus's authority was thinner than he ever admitted. Their silence wasn't indifference, it was a gathering storm. By afternoon, I carried my folder across town to the office of an old colleague, a fellow attorney I trusted. The walls of his workspace were lined with casebooks, diplomas, and framed photos from years of litigation. I laid out the documents on his desk, and for an hour we went line by line. He nodded slowly as he read, confirming what I already knew. Marcus had no legal ground, but more importantly, he pointed out how to frame it in a way the court and the neighborhood would understand. Expired incorporation didn't just invalidate authority, it rendered every action suspect. Walking out of that office, I felt sharper than ever. The petition I'd begun sketching in my downtown office was no longer theory. It was nearly ready to be filed, but before I carried it into a courtroom, it had to pass through a different trial first, the court of public opinion inside Willow Glen. The next evening, I positioned myself at the community pavilion again, where neighbors were beginning to gather, out of curiosity as much as solidarity. This time, I didn't post a single notice. Instead, I laid out copies of the official county records on the picnic tables. No speeches, no declarations, just pages left for anyone brave enough to read. And they did. One by one, residents approached, flipping through the papers, whispering to each other. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered angrily about fines they'd paid under Marcus's watch. The pavilion filled not with fear, but with murmurs of awakening. Across the street, I caught sight of Marcus's patrol truck crawling slowly by. Headlights off, though dusk was falling. He saw the gathering, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not yet. He needed the illusion of control, and stopping now would mean acknowledging he was losing it. His silence was proof my preparation was working. When the neighbors dispersed, I collected the papers and walked them back to my home office. On the desk, the petition waited, nearly finished. I filled in the final sections, citing not only the expired incorporation, but also the patterns of fines, fees, and threats that followed. Grace's testimony would become the hinge, the human voice behind the cold documents. The case wasn't just legal anymore. It was moral, communal, undeniable. Before bed, I made one last stop at a new location, the community basketball court. The lamp above it flickered, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. I stood at the center circle, folder under my arm, imagining the confrontation ahead. The court was worn, neglected, forgotten by the board just like the pool and garden. But soon, neglect would no longer be Marcus's weapon. It would be the proof of his failure. The wind rattled the chain-link fence around me, and I breathed in the sharp night air. Preparation was complete. The evidence was ready. The neighbors were stirring, and in a matter of days, I'd step into the one arena Marcus couldn't silence. A room where truth, once spoken, couldn't be shoved back into the shadows. The chain-link fence rattled behind me as I left the basketball court, the folder pressed tight against my chest. The wind carried the sharp scent of autumn, and with it, the sense that the neighborhood was shifting beneath Marcus's grip. Preparation was finished. Now came the step that mattered most. Positioning myself for the strike. The next morning, I carried the folder to the community center, the very room where Marcus had slammed my sister against the boardroom table. Its fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Rows of chairs were already being set up for the upcoming meeting. I walked slowly through the room, imagining it filled with neighbors, Marcus at the head table, his smirk fixed in place until the weight of truth tore it away. I took a seat in the back row, opened the folder, and rehearsed the order again. The county filings first, Grace's email chain next, then the notices, stacked like falling dominoes. Every page was a step in the staircase I'd built to lead Marcus to his collapse. The room was silent except for the scrape of my pen as I made small adjustments to my notes. When I left, I didn't go home. I walked to a different setting, the neighborhood clubhouse patio. It overlooked the lake, where my father's dock reached out into the water, steady as always. I laid the documents across the patio table and let the breeze stir the edges. This was where Marcus had first declared my dock illegal, where he'd assumed intimidation would silence me. Now, the same place would serve as the backdrop for his undoing. Neighbors passed by, some slowing to glance at the spread of papers, others whispering as they hurried on. One man stopped, frowned, and asked, quietly, "Is it true?" I didn't answer. I simply pointed to the county seal stamped across the top of the filing. His expression hardened, and he walked away muttering. Each encounter was a seed planted. By the time the meeting came, those seeds would be blooming into questions Marcus couldn't ignore. In the afternoon, I visited my downtown office again, not to draft, but to finalize. The petition was complete now, signed and sealed, ready to be filed if Marcus forced my hand. I slid it into the folder behind the evidence, a final card to play if the board refused to acknowledge the truth. It wasn't just preparation anymore. It was positioning. That evening, I returned to Willow Glen and walked to the tennis courts. The chain net sagged, the asphalt cracked, weeds pushing through the edges. Once it had been the heart of community activity. Now it was a monument to mismanagement. I stood at the center, folder in hand, imagining the neighbors who had paid fees for years, expecting repairs that never came. When I spoke at the meeting, this neglect would be part of the narrative. The expired authority wasn't abstract. It was written into every decaying corner of the neighborhood. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw Grace walking along the path that bordered the courts. She stopped when she spotted me, her face pale but resolute. She didn't speak, but she gave a slight nod, the kind that carried more weight than words. It was enough. I knew she would be there, ready to confirm what the documents revealed. Marcus might call me biased, but he couldn't silence her. Back at home, I laid the folder on my desk and turned off every light except the lamp above it. The papers glowed under its beam, a quiet reminder of the days I'd spent pulling this together. My father's photo hung on the wall nearby, his weathered face caught in a smile beside the dock. I stared at it a long time, hearing his voice in memory. Hold your ground. The ground was ready now. The boardroom would be the stage, the neighbors the jury, Marcus the defendant who didn't yet know the trial was coming. I closed the folder, set it neatly at the center of the desk, and let the silence settle around me. The positioning was complete. The next step wasn't preparation anymore. It was confrontation. The folder sat at the center of my desk all night, its weight pressing into the silence of the house. When morning came, I lifted it carefully, as though it were a weapon forged for a single battle. The board meeting wasn't just another confrontation. It was the moment the entire neighborhood would see Marcus for what he was. By evening, the community center was alive with tension. Cars lined the parking lot, neighbors filing in with folded arms and wary expressions. Some came out of habit, others out of curiosity, and a few because the whispers had reached them, and they needed to see the truth for themselves. I stepped through the doors into the fluorescent-lit room, the same one where Marcus had once slammed my sister against the table. Tonight, that table would bear a different weight. The board sat in their usual positions at the front, papers stacked neatly, microphones adjusted, the illusion of authority arranged just so. Marcus sat at the center, his tie knotted tight, his smirk daring anyone to challenge him. Grace was to his right, shoulders stiff, eyes down, her fingers twisting the cap of her pen until it nearly snapped. The crowd filled the rows quickly, murmurs echoing off the walls. I chose a seat in the middle, folder across my lap, and waited. The gavel cracked, and Marcus called the meeting to order, his voice booming with forced confidence. He began with the usual formalities, reading off financial reports and maintenance updates, his tone dripping with authority he no longer possessed. When the agenda turned to violations and enforcement, I rose from my seat. The room fell quiet as I carried the folder forward, my footsteps steady against the linoleum floor. I placed it on the table in front of Marcus, opened it, and spread the documents out for everyone to see. This board has no legal authority to enforce anything, I said, my voice calm but firm. Your incorporation expired nearly 7 years ago. Every fine, every notice, every threat you've issued since then has been built on nothing but intimidation. A ripple moved through the crowd, gasps, whispers, the shifting of bodies leaning forward. Marcus laughed, short and sharp, but it cracked at the edges. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, his eyes narrowing. I slid the county filings across the table, the seal stamped clear at the top. This isn't my opinion. It's the county's record. No renewals filed, no standing to act as a governing body. And you knew I tapped the second stack of papers, the email chain Grace had given me. You told your board to bury it. You threatened your own secretary to keep it quiet. All eyes turned to Grace. Her hands shook as she set her pen down. Then she lifted her chin, her voice breaking but resolute. It's true, she said, the words echoing into the stunned silence. He told us to keep operating. He said no one would ever check. I stayed quiet because I was afraid. But it's true. The crowd erupted, shouts, disbelief, anger spilling into the air. Neighbors stood, pointing at Marcus, voices rising with years of frustration. I paid thousands in fines, one man shouted. You lied to us, a woman near the back cried. The room was no longer his to control. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, shouting for order, but his voice was drowned out by the fury he'd cultivated for years. The gavel struck again and again, but it was useless. Authority without legitimacy is noise, and tonight his noise was swallowed whole. I raised my hand, and slowly the room quieted enough to hear me. You've all been living under rules that no longer had force. He wanted you to believe you had no choice but to obey. But the truth is right here, in black and white. His threats were empty. His power expired the day those filings lapsed. For a moment, silence held. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. Murmurs shifted into agreement. The tide had turned, and Marcus sat frozen at the table, his smirk gone, his face pale. The confrontation wasn't over, but the crowd had seen the truth. And once truth takes hold, no gavel, no threat, no intimidation can put it back in the dark. Marcus sat frozen at the table, the gavel limp in his hand, as the crowd's voices swelled around him. The authority he clung to had been stripped bare in front of everyone. Grace's confession still hung in the air, undeniable and heavy, and the county filings I'd laid on the table glared back at him like a mirror he couldn't shatter. His reign of intimidation was over. He just hadn't accepted it yet. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man cleared his throat, muttering something about procedural errors. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Neighbors stood from their chairs, some holding up copies of the notices Marcus had mailed them, demanding answers. The walls of the community center seemed to vibrate with the sound of their voices. Anger, betrayal, vindication, all rolled into one. I stepped forward again, my hands resting on the edge of the table, steady as the dock that anchored me in this fight. This isn't just about me, I said, loud enough for the room to settle into silence. Every one of you has been fined, threatened, or silenced under rules that legally didn't exist. Marcus made you believe you had no choice, but you do. And tonight, that choice is yours to take back. The silence broke into applause, cautious at first, then swelling until it filled the room. I turned slightly, catching Grace's eyes. She sat straighter now, her hands no longer trembling, her voice carrying strength when she spoke again. We need to vote. Not on Daniel's dock. On Marcus. On whether this board has any right to lead us anymore. The suggestion electrified the room. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now shouted their agreement. Ballots were drafted on scraps of paper. Pens passed down rows. The vote wasn't official in Marcus's sense of the word. Nothing about his expired authority was official anymore. But it was binding in the only way that mattered. The will of the community. Marcus tried one last stand. He rose from his chair, his voice cracking as he barked about bylaws and procedures. But every word sounded hollow now, stripped of the fear that had once given it weight. The crowd drowned him out, chanting louder, their unity crushing his bluster. He slammed the gavel down one final time, but the sound was met with laughter, not silence. When the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. The board, under Marcus's leadership, had been rejected. A new committee of residents would oversee the process of reinstating proper incorporation, this time with transparency and accountability. Marcus sat red-faced, his tie loosened, his posture collapsed. The smirk that had once ruled Willow Glen was gone for good. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors gathered around me, shaking my hand, thanking me, telling me stories of their own fines and frustrations. For the first time in years, the community center didn't feel like a courtroom of intimidation. It felt like common ground again. Grace moved through the crowd quietly, but when she reached me, she paused. Her voice was low, but firm. I should have spoken sooner. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right. Outside, the night was cool, the air sharp with the scent of pine. I walked down the path toward the lake, neighbors trailing behind in small groups, their voices buzzing with energy and relief. When I reached the dock, I stepped onto the boards, the wood creaking under my weight. The water lapped gently against the posts, steady and sure. My father's legacy had survived, not because it was built of timber, but because it was built on principle. I stood there a long time, listening to the ripple of the lake, watching the reflection of the moon shimmer across its surface. Willow Glen wasn't free of struggle yet. No community ever is. But tonight, it had taken its first step out of fear and into ownership. And for the first time, I believed this place could live up to what my father had seen when he built the dock all those years ago. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.